Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 123 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. I'm always putting out the call for new questions, and a couple of people answered that call recently, although I'd love to hear from more of you. Listener Neil S. asked a question that I touched on a little bit in the 2 Death Becomes You episodes. He wrote, I've heard the saying, nobody stays dead in comics except Uncle Ben. Why does a resurrection seem to be such a trope? Lazy storytelling? Cheap scare? Plot device for a larger story? Well, there's a few reasons that this happens, Neil, and one of the major reasons is you. Let's go back to the days before comics, or at least before what we think of as modern comics today. Because, as I've mentioned in a previous episode, sequential art has been around for centuries. Many mythologies, both ancient and modern, contain some resurrection tale as part of their canon. Whether that's the death and rebirth of Osiris, the Sumerian goddess Inanna, also called Ishtar, or more recent Christian mythology. Tales of gods, people, and other creatures, like the mythological Phoenix, we'll get to the X-Men character of the same name later, dying and returning to life have been told and retold, basically since man first realized their own mortality. And comic books, especially the ones with a superhero bent to them, are one of man's modern mythologies, so it makes sense that the same tropes would be seen in each. But it took some time for death and resurrection to become the cliché it is today. Let's look at a little bit of history when it comes to characters in comics returning to life. When characters like Superman and Batman first appeared in the golden age of comics, many of their first villains were ordinary crooks. Thieves, mobsters, con men, and other criminals that existed just as much in the real world as they did on the page. But as their stories went on, in order to add more variety, the nemeses of the heroes became just as colorful, or even more so, than the heroes they were facing. One of the earliest comic book villains of this nature is still one of the best known today. Appearing in Batman #1, the Joker was created by Jerry Robinson, Bill Finger, and Bob Kane. How much each of them contributed is up for debate. Joker was in 2 of the 4 stories in that issue, and in the second one, Joker accidentally stabs himself in the chest during a fight with Batman and appears to be dead. Writer Bill Finger actually wanted to kill the Joker in this story, but the book's editor, sensing the potential for more Joker stories, had a final panel added to the story saying that the Joker survived the stab wound and was going to live. While this first resurrection was handled very clumsily, it became a standard trope for the bigger villains to be defeated in a way that made them appear to be dead to the hero, but left vague enough that they could be brought back in a later issue. So for villains, it was de rigueur to return from death from a very early point. However, it wasn't until over 20 years later that heroes started to come back to life themselves. One of, if not the, first examples was the resurrection of Lightning Lad, one of the founding members of DC's Legion of Superheroes, who died in Adventure Comics number 304, released in 1962, and was brought back to life less than a year later in Adventure Comics number 312, in a famous story that has been homaged many times, especially in the Legion's history. But leaving a character dead for that long can only happen in comics if either the character is part of a team, or if it happens at the end of one comic book run, with the character brought back to life for a new volume. With one major exception that comes to mind, a character's solo book won't go on with the main character apparently dead for months at a time. There were a couple of other heroes that returned after being dead during the next few years, but there's one character who I think opened the floodgates and is probably the most off-sided example for overdoing the death and return storyline. And that is Jean Grey, aka the Phoenix. Jean Grey's first death was very short-lived, as she seemed to die in X-Men number 100 and was brought back in issue number 101. At the time, Jean had left the team along with most of the other original five after their defeat on Krakoa and the recruitment of the all-new X-Men who rescued them from that living island. Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, was the only one to stay an active X-Man, but since Jean was Scott's girlfriend, she was a consistent supporting cast member and happened to be one of the people captured by Sentinels and brought up to a space station run by Stephen Lang. She and the captured X-Men were able to escape and flew a space shuttle back to Earth. Unfortunately, a recent solar flare made conditions lethal to anyone in the space shuttle's cockpit. Jean used her telepathy to instantly learn how to fly the shuttle and tried to use her telekinesis to shield her from the deadly radiation. When the shuttle crashed into Jamaica Bay, her teammates escaped the sinking shuttle. Then, Jean arose from the waters, showing brand new levels of power and referring to herself as the Phoenix. Before this, her code name was Marvel Girl. We eventually learned that this wasn't actually Jean, but was a cosmic being from before the universe's creation known as the Phoenix Force, who had taken on Jean's appearance and memories, while the real Jean was in a telekinetic cocoon under the waters of Jamaica Bay. Not being familiar with human emotions, the Phoenix was fairly easily manipulated by the illusionist called Mastermind, and through a series of events was corrupted into the Dark Phoenix, who went on a rampage throughout space, including the destruction of a planet with 5 billion sentient inhabitants on it. From here, I need to switch from talking about the story in-universe to some behind-the-scenes discussion. At this point in the story, this was supposed to be Jean herself, simply possessed by the Phoenix Force, who was doing all of this. And while the creative team on X-Men, Chris Claremont and John Byrne, intended for Jean to be saved from her darker impulses and become a hero once again, Editor-in-Chief Jim Shooter decreed that wiping out an entire planet's population was too far, and that Jean had to die at the end of this story. And so that's what happened. Using an alien weapon on the moon, Phoenix seemingly sacrificed herself in order to prevent the Dark Phoenix from taking over once again, after bidding farewell to Cyclops. However, the Phoenix Force is harder to kill than that. A small part of that force came across one of the clones of Jean Grey that Mr. Sinister was working on, and used its power to spark new life in his creation. This new clone was named Madeline Pryor, and Sinister sent her to Alaska, where Scott Summers was meeting up with his grandparents. The two met, and unsurprisingly, Scott fell for the woman who was an exact duplicate of his lost love. Madeline feigned any knowledge of her connection to Jean, although she gave a backstory of having survived a plane crash at the exact moment that Jean died on the moon. Scott and Madeline were quickly married, and Madeline was the mother of Christopher Summers, who later was sent to the far future and came back to the present as the X-Force leader Cable. But wedded bliss was not to last, especially after Jean was actually brought back. The Avengers found the cocoon Jean was slowly healing in, and brought it to the Fantastic Four to study, as they couldn't see what or who was inside of it. Due to the trauma, when Jean comes out of the cocoon, her telepathic powers are gone, but her telekinetic powers are stronger. Going back to some behind-the-scenes stories, it had been decided to create a new X-Men related book titled X Factor, starring the original X-Men. At first, a new character was going to join the team in Jean's stead, but editorial once again came in and overruled that, saying that Jean needed to be brought back. Interestingly, the idea for how Jean's resurrection would work and let her be separate from the Phoenix that had killed billions of people came from the mind of Kurt Busiek, who thought it up even before the Dark Phoenix had died. Through various conversations, the idea got to John Byrne, who pitched it to the editors, and Kurt was given a special thanks in the issue in which Jean returned. This was one of Kurt's earliest credits at Marvel, but by no means his last, as he went on to become an acclaimed writer himself. Since this storyline returning Jean to life, she has gone on to die and return 2 more times, plus have a time-displaced younger version of herself featured in the books during one of the times she was apparently dead. While it's fitting for someone named Phoenix to have stories involving resurrection, I think she's one of the main culprits people think of when they say that death in comics has lost its meaning. So, while I've covered some of the history of the resurrection stories, that still doesn't quite answer Neil's question, which is, why? Well, I think that varies from story to story. First, let's split this into 2 categories: planned returns and unplanned. When both the death and return are done by the same creative team and in reasonably short succession, that's obviously planned. For instance, the death and return of Superman storyline. Everyone working on the Superman family of books knew that Kal-El was not going to stay dead, and they worked out how he was returning before they wrote the story that killed him off. While there's a certain amount of shock value in a story like this, as was evidenced by the phenomenon that the death of Superman became, the creators usually have a larger idea they are working towards, like showing what the world is like without that character, and then distilling down and showing what makes that dying character different from the other characters in that universe. Again, using Superman as an example, by having 4 characters all claim to be the successor to the Man of Steel, you saw different aspects of Superman that made for interesting characters in their own right, but none of them could truly replace Superman himself. Next, we have the unplanned returns. Phoenix is one example, while Hal Jordan and Barry Allen, the Silver Age Green Lantern and Flash, respectively, are others. Often in these cases, it's the fans themselves that insist on the character eventually returning. We can go all the way back to Sherlock Holmes for another example of this. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had killed off the detective, throwing him and Moriarty off of Reichenbach Falls in The Final Problem. Doyle had tired of telling Sherlock stories and wanted to move on. But ongoing pressure from the fans, including Doyle's own mother among many others, prompted the writer to bring back Holmes 10 years later, explaining to Watson in The Adventure of the Empty House that he had faked his death in order to fool his enemies. And for a number of reasons, publishers are much more likely to get letters saying, "Bring this character back," as opposed to, "Keep this character dead." So it makes sense that eventually a writer, either listening to the fans of the hero or being a fan of the hero themselves, will decide to find a way to bring said character back to life. How well these returns end up working is very much a personal opinion and can vary greatly from story to story. Personally, I think Hal Jordan's return was well thought out and added quite a bit to the character's mythos, while Barry Allen's return felt much more forced and rote, despite both stories coming from the same creative team. But you would be completely in your rights to have the complete opposite opinion on either or both. And try to remember that many of these characters have been written about in stories for 60 to 80 years now. There's very few tales that haven't been told about these heroes in one form or another during their publishing lives. So while it's easy for us as readers to dismiss a death/resurrection plot as lazy storytelling, most creators want to do everything they can to tell the most original stories they can, and are usually fans of the properties they're working on, so try to cut them some slack and have a sympathetic eye when judging the results. I think that covers your question, Neil, but if there's more you'd like to know about, please let me know. As I say pretty much every episode, your questions help keep the show going, so keep them coming. Or just let me know what you think of the show in general. You can reach me via email at welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you'd prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, come join the Patreon at patreon.com/welcometogeektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All of their sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.